Welcome back, everyone. I think we're about ready for our final keynote address. Our final keynote will feature a discussion between two educators on the topic of civility in academic and political discourse. Deborah S. Mower is Associate Professor of Philosophy in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Youngstown State University. After receiving her BA at Pacific University, Dr. Mower took her MA and PhD in philosophy from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is the president of the Society for Ethics across the curriculum. Much of Dr. Mower's work addresses the complex difficulties of civil discourse and is thus well known for its creative engagement with a variety of fields. Dr. Mower has published numerous articles on moral psychology and applied ethics and draws from her work in social cognition, moral education and development, the evolution of moral faculties, and Eastern and Western approaches to virtue ethics. Dr. Mower's recent book, Civility in Politics and Education, is a brilliant example of such direct scholarly engagement with the immediate difficulties faced by anyone in discourse. Its ultimate success is in getting us to think more deeply, more carefully about public and private debate. Encountering Dr. Mower's work, one of the most important conclusions we arrive at is that the concept of civility in debate does not merely denote polite behavior, but rather is a necessary condition of productive discourse. Dr. Mower's discussion partner today is Noreen Myers. Ms. Myers received her BA in political science at Grand Valley State University. She later did graduate work in political philosophy at Loyola University and Georgetown University before taking her JD from Thomas Cooley Law School. In 2005, Ms. Myers was appointed to the Board of Trustees at Grand Valley, chaired the Academic Affairs Committee, and then was named the first alumnus board chair. Ms. Myers has also served in a variety of political leadership roles. She was a member of the initial advisory board of the Michigan Political Leadership Program in 1992 and was chairperson of Breakfast Forum, a program that featured speakers on politics and discourse. Myers also co-founded the Progressive Women's Alliance and continues to serve on the board. It's my pleasure to welcome our keynote speakers, Deborah Mower and Noreen Myers.
Thank you. So we have a little bit of an unusual format. It's a keynote along with a conversation, so we're going to be sitting. So I hope you will forgive us for sort of perching on the edge of a podium. It's a little odd. So we're going to start this talk by looking at several points throughout the conversation. First, going to look at the problem, and we'll be using a framework that I'm developing, and then we'll be using that framework for our conversation at the end. So first, I'm going to start by examining what I think the problem is, and then I'm going to be thinking about what the goal is for thinking about the concept of civility, thinking about the marketplace of ideas, thinking about the academy, and how we can try to address the problem that we're looking at for this whole conference, which is the issue of politicization and the issue of what this means for the liberal arts and how we should evaluate the role of politicization in the liberal arts. Next, we're going to take a very quick look at the concept of civility, which is derived from the book that was so wonderfully introduced. And then I'm going to turn and offer a detailed analysis of the marketplace of ideas. I know we're all familiar with this concept, but there's some really good philosophical insights, I think, that can be gained by going back and looking at it with greater depth. And so we can derive some interesting conditions by thinking about the marketplace of ideas in more detail. Next, I'll turn and look at conditions for civil disagreement, which is a helpful way of thinking about how we might engage in these really tough questions and tough debates when it comes to education and politics. And then the last part of this event is where we engage in our conversation. We'll be looking at various solutions that we offer by thinking about the marketplace using this framework that I've presented. So we're going to start by thinking about two problems, really. And we might separate this into two components, but I found this political cartoon, and as some of you already know, I love political cartoons. They appear in everything I do. They're witty and insightful, and they offer some really philosophical analyses for ways of thinking about problems. So here's a case where you might think of this as two individuals who actually do have common ground. They're standing on the same center point, yet they're actively chipping away at what had been common ground. So what are the two problems that I see? Well, first, there's actual politicization, which is where we might think of this in terms of group identification, so where we're trying to identify with one group, one party, one ideology rather than another. We might be paying attention to the political power that one group has over another. We could look at this in the academy. We could look at it in actual politics. But this part of that we could, and we have addressed throughout the whole conference, is that this comes in many forms. So first, with Neil Gross's work, we were looking at differences in the demographic between the distribution of liberal and conservative professors. We could also take a look at the issue of bias, maybe the selection of texts in courses. We could also talk about the kinds of things we were just addressing at the end of the last round of panelists, which is the issue of having an agenda or engaging in activism, which, to use the definition of pornography, we may not know how to define it, but we all know it when we see it, right? So there's something to that. I think it's important. So I'm not going to offer a definition of what an agenda is or activism is, but we do recognize that that is in itself the problem. There's something morally problematic about having an inappropriate agenda. There's a larger question as to what that is. The second problem that I really see here is really the perception of politicization, and this is the case where it may not be politicization at all, but it's interpreted that way. And so there, the real problem comes in when we think of maybe some different targets or different demographics that might have an interpretation of politicization. We might think of how students interpret politicization in the academy. We might think of how parents interpret it, and of course the academy's role in the broader public. How is it that they're seeing what the work is that we do in the academy, and why do they interpret it as being politicized or not? So the real question of this entire summit is, how can we find common ground? And we'll offer what we think are some hopeful solutions, certainly not the final word, although we are at the end of this whole event, so we do take that to mean that we have the final word, thanks to Gleaves. We will be humble, though. Perhaps you will have some additional things to add. So first, we'll be taking a look at some solutions we could offer at the level of the classroom, so what an individual professor could or could not do to mitigate this problem. Next, we'll take a look at what this might mean when we're looking at the curriculum or we're talking about university policy. Then we're going to take a look at what this might mean for the sort of work that Matthew's engaged in, with looking at differences in the choices academics make with regard to going into academia for their career, which affects, of course, the demographic. And lastly, we're going to take a look at this from the standpoint of culture and think about these larger issues in politics themselves. But I really want to emphasize that all of these should not be seen as disconnected problems. Really, they're all larger and individual pieces of a larger puzzle. And so with that in mind, it's going to be important to think about what kind of goal do we want to set? What is the background puzzle? If you ever, I know all of you have done a puzzle, it's very helpful to have the image on the box in front of you to give you that goal, to help you sort and filter. And so use that metaphor as we're going through here, that this is really setting the goal as the theoretical perspective that we're using. So all of you know John Stuart Mill, and all of you know John Stuart Mill well, but he was a utilitarian philosopher who was writing in the 1800s, and I'm going to be using all of these quotes today from his classic text on liberty, which he wrote in 1859. And again, I don't need to remind any of you in this audience, but it has been striking to me that with the exception of, I think, just one speaker, we all have assumed that we know what it is to be liberal. And that concept itself has been defined in various ways. And so I'm going to limit my discussion of this in a very narrow sense to think of it solely in the way that John Stuart Mill was thinking of it. So looking at the etymology of the word, the root of the word comes from Latin, which is coming from the concept of freedom itself, and liberty and freedom of the will, freedom of choice, and as we see with will, the freedom of conscience. So he says, this then is the appropriate region of human liberty. It comprises first the inward domain of consciousness, demanding liberty of conscience in the most comprehensive sense. Liberty of thought and feeling, absolute freedom of opinion and sentiment on all subjects, practical or speculative, scientific, moral, or theological. So for Mill, his interest here is not so much in the freedom of an individual person, which I think is how many people read Mill, as how is it that a single individual could have freedom of thought. But for Mill, it's really in the collective freedom of the citizenry itself. So we have this wonderful quote, not that it is solely or chiefly to form great thinkers that freedom of thinking is required. On the contrary, it is as much and even more indispensable to enable average human beings to attain the mental stature which they are capable of. There have been, and may again be, in great individual thinkers in a general atmosphere of mental slavery, but never has there been, nor ever will be, in that atmosphere, an intellectually active people. And so his emphasis here, his goal here, the picture, the larger picture that we're working with as we sort through all these puzzle pieces is to think about the background citizenry and how we can develop that. So before we move on to think about the concept of the marketplace of ideas, I want to go very quickly through what civility is not. So we first might think it's something like this, right? Civility, because there's nothing like a cup of tea when you're stabbing someone in the back. And this is the concept that I think most people have when they use this term. They think civility is just this superficial niceness so that you can really manipulate someone, you can twist them, you can do things to them behind their back. But of course, that's actually quite immoral. That's clearly not civility. So we've got to exclude that. So here's a second option. Politeness is the art of choosing among one's real thoughts. So notice this would allow for the possibility that you actually do have a variety of perspectives and opinions, and you're not trying to manipulate someone or harm them, but you're going to just select one thought from all of them. So there's still a measure of dishonesty here. I'm going to suggest that's not civility either. So civility is not mere politeness. It is not simply courtesy in behavior and speech. It is not restricting ideas. It is not restricting free speech, because notice to restrict free speech would be to restrict ideas and their discussion. Many people think that civility is going to be a limitation on our social interactions, so the common assumption that one should not talk about politics at dinner, maybe not at Christmas dinner anyway. Notice it's not about restricting our interactions. Civility is about none of those things. But before we give a definition of what civility is, it's helpful to think about what the marketplace of ideas offers, because that gives us the conditions for what civility is. So the marketplace of ideas was a concept that has been attributed to Mill, but he never used that term, but it aptly describes the position that he holds. So he says, whatever people believe on subjects on which it is of the first importance to believe rightly, they ought to be able to defend against at least the common objections. If the cultivation of the understanding consists in one thing more than in another, it is surely in learning the grounds of one's own opinions. And so when we think about the concept of Mill's marketplace of ideas, we oftentimes think of it as something kind of like a grocer's shop, where there are a million options that we could choose from, and one could simply wander aisles and randomly select from the grocery shelves anything you like and stick them in your cart, and that you have unlimited, unfettered freedom from among this huge array of options. But Mill doesn't think of it in that way. For Mill, the marketplace of ideas and the selection of one idea from another must be constrained by facts and evidence. So we are not to randomly simply just select an idea because we happen to like it. There has to be a reason, there has to be a justification for choosing one idea over another. He says, wrong opinions and practices gradually yield to fact and argument, but facts and arguments, to produce any effect on the mind, must be brought before it. Very few facts are able to tell their own story without comments to bring out their meaning. So think for a moment of how random it would be to simply select ideas without reasons. They would be justificationless ideas. There would be no reason to select one idea rather than another. So this is the kind of notion that Mill is trying to capture here, which is that the selection of ideas must be based on facts and evidence, because it is how they are interpreted and the comments that they are given which give them their meaning, which give them their significance, which give them their importance and their justification. So the second idea that I think many people assume for Mill's marketplace of ideas is, well, perhaps really what we're doing when we evaluate ideas is that we have several offers, and we evaluate one in light of its merits and demerits, and then we evaluate a second one in light of its merits and demerits. And so there we are using facts and evidence, and so we're selecting between two ideas, and if we pick one, that's all that needs to be done. Marketplace of ideas has been satisfied for Mill. But notice that conception assumes, as with the thinker that we have on the screen, that conception of the marketplace assumes a very solitary affair. It assumes that I, as a single individual, am sitting here in my own head weighing offers for their merits and demerits. And Mill thought that that was absolutely the wrong approach. So for Mill, the second condition is engagement with others. I love this sculpture. It's a faux conversation. It's FDR and Winston Churchill, two famous allies. This is a sculpture that's in London. And this is just classic for the kind of thing that Mill is trying to get at here. He says he is capable of rectifying his mistakes by discussion and experience, not by experience alone. There must be discussion to show how experience is to be interpreted. So although we do often adopt this model of the solitary lone thinker with these masterful powers of human reasoning on his own, Mill says we really need others as a corrective. And in what way? So just in case you can't see it, unicorns are real, and I defy anyone who tells me they're not. They're just fat, gray, and we call them rhinos. Right. So this is a wonderful example of how, through conversation with others, our ideas are actually corrected. I might have a concept of unicorns, and I may believe that they exist, but notice if I'm misapplying that term or that concept, that will come up in conversation. Noreen will say, well, I don't really think that those gray fat things over there are unicorns. Do you notice they don't have any sparkly fairy dust behind them as they run? They've got a green cloud, right? So she can start to correct me and challenge my beliefs and the proper application of the term in applying the notion of unicorn to these fat gray creatures scampering through looks like a forest with a waterfall in the background. So for Mill, the steady habit of correcting and completing his own opinion by collating it with those of others, so far from causing doubt and hesitation in carrying it into practice, is the only stable foundation for a just reliance on it. For, being cognizant of all that can be said against him, knowing he has sought for objections and difficulties, and has shut out no light which can be thrown upon the subject, he has a right to think his judgment better than that of any person or any multitude who have not gone through a similar process. So notice this again isn't simply a judgment that a single solitary individual makes. This is a conclusion that an individual makes only after having engaged in a collective interaction with others for the purposes of correction. So the third component then for the marketplace of ideas is that one must respect the rules of reasoning, which are logic. So simple example, regardless of what I may want to believe, 2 + 2 simply is not 5. I may have been taught that erroneously by some evil babysitter that I might have had, right? I had an older sibling who told me for years that there were monsters under my bed. I may have all sorts of beliefs that are false, but notice it doesn't matter how fervently I believe them. They either are true or they're not, and in this case, this belief is false. So Mill says, no one can be a great thinker who does not recognize that as a thinker, it is his first duty to follow his intellect to whatever conclusions it may lead. Truth gains even more by the errors of one who, with due study and preparation, thinks for himself, than by the true opinions of those who only hold them because they do not suffer themselves to think. The whole strength and value, then, of human judgment, depending on the one property, that it can be set right when it is wrong. Reliance can be placed on it only when the means of setting it right are kept constantly at hand. And for Mill, what are those means of setting it right? It is having conversation, interaction with others. They are the corrective for our beliefs. So out of this, I think, expanded analysis of the notion of the marketplace of ideas, we can derive some conditions for civil disagreement. And what's interesting about Mill's marketplace is it both sets the conditions for civil disagreement and it also presupposes those conditions. And so what are they? Well, notice participants must have the willingness to weigh ideas by facts and evidence. This is a necessary condition for the marketplace of ideas. Participants must have an interest in constructive engagement. They must be able to engage with others and seek out doing so as a corrective for their ideas. Notice they must have respect for the rules of reasoning so that when others have corrected them and shown them that this simply is not a unicorn, they must be willing to accept the conclusion that they've been misapplying that term all these years. So civility, then, we can come to a definition of what that is by using this notion of the marketplace. Civility functions to aid rational discourse in politics and education by providing shared expectations and standards for attitudes, behavior, argumentation, reasoning, and evidence. And we might think of those shared expectations and standards in terms of particular attitudes that we might take. Willingness, interest, and respect. Each of which are ideas that have been highlighted in various portions of this summit throughout the entire time. We've heard lots of people talking about them in various different ways. The concept of humility fits in nicely. It's not listed here, but the concept of humility fits in nicely with the need for willingness, right? The interest in engagement. But notice this also gives us some standards. This gives us facts and evidence. It gives us a requirement of constructive engagement, not a solitary practice, and it gives us rules of reasoning. So out of thinking of Mill's marketplace of ideas, we not only get shared expectations, which can perhaps provide a common ground, but we also get some standards, which may provide the necessary language so that we can have a common ground. So informed and engaged disagreement, then, is not incivility if we're using these shared standards and these shared methods of reasoning. So regardless of your political persuasion, this cartoon captures very nicely what civility is and is not. So I know it's small print. I'll read it to you. All we're saying is that it's high time we reevaluate the validity of this all or nothing interpretation of the Second Amendment, says the little fellow. And the big strapping fellow says, hey, let's keep it civil over there, hippie, right? The idea that we cannot even engage in a conversation would be, of course, quite uncivil. That would be to restrict free speech. But to engage in the analysis of ideas is not uncivil. To engage in informed disagreement is not uncivil. Rather, if you think of Mill's notion of this shared enterprise of a marketplace of ideas, it's precisely that kind of constructive engagement that he's interested in. So I think it's fair to say that the shared expectations and standards themselves are the common ground. And I want to throw this out as a possibility for all of us to think about. This is why I like to believe I've got the final word. I'm offering this really as a proposal for what the common ground might be, and then we'll also be taking a look at how we could try to develop it in the academy. So we've got these three conditions again. So thinking about this as a common ground, though, how could we break this down even further? Well, notice we might think of this as a process or a procedure that individuals might go through in a conversation with others. They might decide on ground rules. Some of you have talked about the importance of setting up ground rules in your classes for discussion. You might think of this as talking about the importance of the academic enterprise, the liberal education, what it is that we're doing here, stressing that to students. And it might also involve explicitly having students study logic as forms of rules of reasoning. But we could also think about this as having a set of skills. So for students to engage in this process at all, I do moral psychology, philosophy of mind. I am always thinking about the cognitive skills required for anything. It's my innate bias from my discipline, right? I'm always looking for answers to those questions. So we might think of this when we're thinking about education and learning as taking a step back and looking at really the other side of the coin. We have this goal that we're looking towards. So what would be the skills that would be necessary for us to get there? So this could be both a process and a procedure and a set of skills. So now this changes our question a little bit, because now we can ask, so how could we try to teach those particular skills rather than just trying to find the overarching theoretical question about the common ground? So this is where Noreen and I are each going to offer some perspectives and solutions for the individual features that we looked at, for the puzzle pieces we started with at the beginning. And I encourage you to keep Mill's notion of marketplace of ideas in the background the entire time. We're going to go back to these two problems that we started with. First, perceived politicization or actual politicization, and the perception of politicization. And so how can we think about the marketplace and think about the academy and what it is that we're doing at universities across the country? How is it that we can think about that as a marketplace where ideas are on offer from any discipline, any field, different theoretical perspectives, and how could we use that concept of the university as a marketplace of ideas to try to address these two problems of actual politicization and then the perception of it. So we'll take a look at each one of these features and we'll go through them really one by one. Oh, excuse me, I forgot about this slide. So before we do that, as we go through them one by one, I'm going to break this down into two more components. First, we're going to be addressing each criteria or each level of the academy and then looking at the two different pieces for them. So starting off by thinking about the classroom and the professor, what could we say there for how to address these two problems of actual politicization and perception? Well, if we go back to the conditions for civil disagreement, we might find them to be somewhat helpful. The willingness to weigh ideas by facts and evidence, the interest in constructive engagement, and respect for the rules of reasoning. And again, if we think of this as both a process and a set of skills, it might be quite helpful. Because notice, we could think of them as skills for competitive intellectual training. What is it that we're doing in the liberal arts? We're trying to teach students how to think, and we don't mean that in a very generic way. We mean it in a very specific way. We mean it in a way of analyzing ideas in a very critical sense to evaluate them. So how could we do that? Well, let's go back to Mill's marketplace of ideas again. First, we would start out by teaching them rules of logic. We would teach them rules of reasoning. So I'm going to beg a bit of bias again for my own discipline. I'm a philosopher. I think that philosophy does this especially well, partly because we actively teach logic, but also because critical thinking is the very essence of our discipline. I know that many other disciplines also teach critical thinking, but the definition or the conception of what critical thinking is varies in other disciplines. And as someone on my university assessment committee, believe me, I know that every discipline believes they teach critical thinking. It's hotly contested. But philosophy does teach logic and critical thinking courses, and so one of the things we might think about to mitigate this problem of either actual politicization or perception of it would be to think about having students take both critical thinking and logic courses as part of a standard curriculum, and also to integrate that within every course. So one of the things that I do when I start off courses is we run through sets of informal fallacies. And I encourage students that I want them to start looking for these in every newspaper article they read, in every movie they watch, in every news report they hear, in their best friend's argument about why they shouldn't have to do the dishes, or why they should take the rent money and go out and watch films, or whatever it is. To look for these kinds of fallacies in every case. And once they start looking for them, they'll find them. And once they're practiced in doing that, they can start to identify them in their own reasoning and thought. But first, you have to teach the actual fallacies. Next, we might move to actual engagement. This is where we would be taking a look at particular ideas and evaluating ideas on offer. So whatever the topic is in question, how to evaluate Plato's Republic, how to evaluate a text by Homer, what the moral status is or is not on abortion, whatever the topic is, we have to engage in others. And so I teach a lot of ethics courses. I've taught contemporary moral issues at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and now I teach, and I also taught environmental ethics there too. And at Youngstown State University, I teach a lot of professional ethics. And the sort of thing that I do in all of these courses is I start off the class by making it very clear to them that the entire course for the entire semester is a collective enterprise. And one of the nice things about professional ethics is I say to them, we're going to be addressing, I give them the whole long spiel. I won't give you the full spiel, but a shortened version of it. I start off the course by explaining to them that you're going into a professional field and you're going to be addressing and coming across many ethical dilemmas that you have not even thought would ever occur to you, because it's not the kind of thing that students consider when they're actively learning their courses of study to become young professionals. They're busy learning ideas and concepts and strategies and methods and studying for exams. But I tell them that in every single case, I have students who contact me years later, and they say, you know, that ethics course that I thought I was going to hate, that I never thought that I would use, I can't tell you how valuable that course was, because I actually did use it. I just had a case in my internship last week, and it reminded me of one of the case studies we talked about, because I never would have thought that this sort of situation was an ethical issue. But after taking your class, I now realize and recognize that as a moral problem, and I wouldn't have noticed it before. This happens all of the time. And so one of the things that I encourage students to do is to think about the fact that in this course, you have an unexpected opportunity that you will never have again. Never again will you have an option to be in a class with a group of fellow students who are examining the same cases, the same moral problems, with the same reasoning, so that you have the same set of conceptual tools to analyze them. What's even more beneficial about this is that these are hypothetical cases, or even if they're moral questions that come from real life, they're abstracted from our own personal lives. It's a question that we're examining. It's not my personal dilemma at the moment. And so in that sense, it's hypothetical. What's beneficial about that is I encourage the students to think of it in the following way. We can examine these cases and talk about them and try different ideas on for size, and think about if we were to adopt this course of action, what would be the likely result? If it turns out to be something disastrous that likely would have caused the death of thousands, right? No harm has occurred, because this is merely a hypothetical case. But unfortunately, once you leave the university and you go out into the real world and you take on that role of a professional, if you make the wrong decision there can oftentimes be disastrous consequences for which you cannot take them back. So what is so beneficial about having this community of fellow scholars in this class, I tell them, is because not only do you get the benefit of a redo, a retry, where you can try on different ideas and see how they work, but you also get the benefit of having the conversation with your fellow classmates. Unfortunately, in the real world, you're bound by conditions of confidentiality. You often cannot speak to your fellow coworkers. Indeed, they might be the problem, the ones engaging in the moral transgression. You cannot speak to your spouse. You oftentimes cannot go to your boss. You very often have no one to whom you can turn. And so having this opportunity where you can truly engage in thinking about moral situations and cases and practice them as a form of training is a valuable opportunity you will never have again in your entire lives. And I expand on this and I give it with much more gravitas. And at the end, they all look like they've been plastered in their chairs, right? It sets the tone wonderfully for the rest of the entire semester as we go through all the cases, and I remind them from time to time. And what it does is it sets this kind of engaged enterprise. So they see what they're doing not as, I've got a personal stake on this moral issue here, and you've got that one, and well, you're just wrong, and that's not the goal. What they see this as is, okay, we've got this situation here. What conceptual tools could we use to try to approach it? Well, Noreen, what do you think about that? Well, I never thought of it that way, right? They keep bouncing ideas back and forth off each other, using concepts we gain as we go throughout the semester to try to get better insight on the cases. So how could we use Mill's notion of the marketplace of ideas then, using facts and evidence? Well, notice part of facts and evidence, as Mill says, is interpreting facts. And that is where engagement with others is so important. I might look at a particular claim. I can think of many wonderful conversations I've had with all of you over lunches and dinners and over beverages after the conference, where there's been an initial claim made. So, for example, one at lunch, someone made a claim that friends were proposing liberal conspiracy theories. And I thought, well, I'm a liberal. I don't know any liberal conspiracy theories. Maybe I'm not radical enough or something. I don't know. And so I asked the question, what is a liberal conspiracy theory? Frankly, I don't know what a conservative conspiracy theory would be either. So this amounted to a really engaging conversation we had about what it was for anything to be a conspiracy theory and how we would know if it were a conspiracy theory or not. And it's that kind of discussion that I mean to capture here with this notion of facts and evidence. When Mill's talking about facts, he's not simply talking about stats and hard numbers. He's also talking about the correction of our ideas because of how we've initially interpreted something. We may initially jump to a snap position, and so our conversation with others can help pull us back, can help rein us in. To use Matthew's phrase, he and his wife apparently do this for each other very nicely. They rein each other in when they've instantly jumped to an interpretation that might not be the best account of that. And so Mill is accounting for that notion of evidence in the correction of concepts. And then notice as we go throughout the curriculum in our courses, we can engage in full combat with students in many ways. This is not the sort of thing you do in lower division courses. This is only the sort of thing you can do with your upper division students and or your majors or graduate students. What do I mean by full combat? Well, notice students are going to start trying out ideas. As they go through in this cooperative exchange, and we're looking at ethical issues and ethical dilemmas, I always press them. I tell them at the beginning of the semester, I will ask you 2 questions in regard to every single issue, and you must answer them both. The first question for any case, what is your position? I want to know what your stand is. If you were a professional in this case, what would you do? What action would you take? Second question, what justifies that action? What argument can you give me that that's the right course of action? And notice, I really don't care their answer to the first question. What I'm interested in is their judgments and their arguments that they offer for the second. And this is where the concept of full combat really comes into play, because this is where other students begin to challenge them. Well, I don't really think that's the best argument to do option A. I think a better argument for option A would be this other thing over here. Or a student will make a claim, and I can say, well, that's an interesting argument. Have you considered this implication? Right? So again, to think of this as being some form of politicization, I think would be problematic. Rather, I think it's more the athletic form of training them in the art of developing arguments. And so we might think of this very explicitly as competitive training for citizenry, developing this kind of athletic skill set of the mind, or this athletic toolkit, as you like, which is rigorous and strong, that enables them to evaluate cases, situations, arguments, and come to have a better sense of how they can interpret facts and evidence. So what would this kind of conceptual training be? Well, notice it actually teaches respect for the rules of reasoning. Why? Because you are engaging in the rules of reasoning constantly. They're constantly on the lookout for fallacies. They're constantly on the lookout for evidence that they can find of hard sciences or not. They're constantly on the lookout for hidden assumptions that someone might be making, slippages between concepts. Notice it definitely teaches them how to be engaged in a joint critical endeavor, because that's the purpose of the entire course. And no conversation in the class proceeds without such a joint critical endeavor. And it definitely teaches them how to weigh ideas by facts and evidence. And that's the only way it can be taught, is through repetition. And writing is the same way. I forget which panel it was where someone suggested having students do writing each day, and that's exactly right. To teach them those sorts of skills, it must be constant repetition. So Mill says, it is the fashion of the present time to disparage negative logic, that which points out weaknesses in theory or errors in practice without establishing positive truths. Such negative criticism cannot be valued too highly, and until people are again systematically trained to it, there will be few great thinkers and a low general average of intellect. Right? Now, this is like a marketing campaign for philosophy, as far as I'm concerned. Right? Teaching students logic, critical reasoning, and how to evaluate arguments by facts and evidence. And this is a project that we take the heritage of quite seriously, that began 2,500 years ago with Plato and Aristotle. And so when we're thinking about issues of actual politicization, we'll notice this kind of approach instantly, I don't want to say sidesteps, but actively removes conditions for politicization. Because notice that the abuse of power or manipulation is not only unethical, but it's unprofessional if this strategy, this process, is applied. But notice that simply presenting ideas that are contrary to a student's belief is certainly not politicization, because that's what the very process of engagement is. That's every conversation, is presenting ideas that are contrary to a student's belief. I think it's inevitable for any conversation, for any human being, on any topic ever, that there will be ideas presented that are contrary. So in thinking about this broader problem of politicization and what it is, I don't have a solution. I'm going to have to know it when I see it. But one of the things I know that it can't be is it can't be something that is mere disagreement with what one believes or with what a student believes. So that is one way we can try to minimize this problem or the charge of active politicization, is we can simply say, presenting ideas that individuals disagree with is not politicization, period. That is not a sufficient condition. And notice it's the only way you can actually teach students the grounds of their own opinions, is they have to develop this active athletic conception. So Mill says, all that part of the truth which turns the scale and decides the judgment of a completely informed mind is known to those who have attended equally and impartially to both sides and endeavored to see the reasons of both in the strongest light. So essential is this discipline to a real understanding of moral and human subjects that if opponents of all important truths do not exist, it is indispensable to imagine them and supply them with the strongest arguments which the most skillful devil's advocate can conjure up. So we've also talked quite a bit in this summit about the notion of intellectual diversity and academic diversity. And notice for Mill here, given this notion of the marketplace of ideas and the necessity of this kind of engagement, and this confrontational is not the right word, but this active challenge at every turn to ideas in a collaborative project requires that if we don't have someone to present those ideas, then we better present them ourselves. And to fail to do so would be a form of politicization. So how can we address the perception of it then? Perception's tricky. I know my students believe all kinds of things about me. all of them are wildly inaccurate. And the best example of this is years ago when I was teaching environmental ethics. I tried so incredibly hard to give students no conception of my standing on any topic that we went through for the entire semester. And I read my student evaluations at the end, and it was just remarkable. All the meat eaters thought that I was a vegetarian, PETA-loving crazy, and so they hated me. And all the farmers and hunters thought that, and all the PETA people thought that I was a meat-eating hunter. So, I mean, you just couldn't please anybody. And I remember that I was walking on campus a couple of weeks after the semester ended, and I had a fur coat, and I was wearing this fur coat. And I came across a student who was vegetarian, and he looked as though I had just told him God himself did not exist. I mean, it was just this undercutting of everything he believed. And it was clear to me that students, we think that they have a better sense of getting at what our political views actually are. I'm really interested in the kind of research that Dr. Wessner and Dr. Gross are doing, because at least from my perspective in the classroom, students honestly have no conception. I think what they're more likely tapping into are other facts about me. So given that you know that the field of philosophy is highly male-dominated, if you know that I'm a woman, and I can't really hide it, if you know that I'm a woman in philosophy, you can make a lot of inferences about what I probably believe. But when it comes to the actual teaching of the material in the course, I think I do an excellent job of keeping my positions hidden. So what can we say with regard to the perception? Well, notice one must become a devil's advocate. It's an essential tool in our toolkit of teaching. But more importantly than that, I think we have to not shy away from any form of debate, but we must actively engage in the clash of ideas. So I think we need to put it into the course design. I think it's important and essential for students to have that kind of opportunity. So if you think about this on the model of an ethics course, I have certainly my own opinions on the best moral theory. I've got all kinds of very sophisticated theoretical arguments for which moral theories are much more sophisticated than others and why, how they lead to moral objectivity and why, and truth and all of those things. But, of course, I'll go through and present all of the different moral perspectives from an array of positions. And as we go through and evaluate the different cases, I'll encourage students to take on and try a different hat from the different moral theories. So if you were going to be a good Kantian, I want you to think as though you were a Kantian and put on your Kantian hat. How would a Kantian approach this problem, right? How would someone who is a Humean approach this problem? Again, not that I want them to become Kantians or Humeans, but I want them to know what it is to be a Kantian or a Humean and to have those skills in thinking about how to approach the problem from that standpoint. So it must be in the course design. The actual clash, I think, must be in the course design for both those on the left and the right side of the spectrum to avoid politicization. So the last part of this I think is so essential is we must emphasize civility. And we've talked about many different ways we can set up courses, the kinds of preface that we give to them, but I think it also must be in course policy or in your learning outcomes. And so I have a section in each syllabus on our learning environment. And I stress very clearly to the students that I will not be the thought police. I actually don't care. And I honestly don't care what their position is, their final conclusion is on many issues. My interest is I want to demand the quality of the reasons that they present for them. And so in philosophy, progress is made by delving into ideas from all frameworks and all perspectives. And it's having precisely that array of options to look at, which truly gives progress. So I think emphasizing civility, not just in how you model it in your interaction in the classroom, but also formally as a policy and as a learning outcome as well, to make it clear to the students that this is one of the skills that you should be gaining from this course. This is a piece of knowledge. It is a practiced form of knowledge. It is a skill of thought to gain from the course itself. So let's go back and look at the second piece of this, the curriculum and the university policy. How can we address actual politicization and then the perception of it? Noreen?
Well, just briefly, my contribution to this part of it is more by way of example. And again, I don't know if you came in late, I was on the Board of Trustees at Grand Valley for 8 years, and I'm not now, and I'm not speaking for the university. I'm not speaking as a, I don't want that to be clear.
Me neither.
Okay. And as far as the perception of politicization among the Board of Trustees, I found it interesting when I was on the board, and that, well, for those of you that are not from Michigan, in Michigan we have 2 different ways that you could be on the Board of Trustees of a university. Excuse me. And one is at the larger research universities, you run for office. And to run you have to be appointed by a political party. So you come on to the board where you're going to be making university policy. You come on with I think, most likely a partisan agenda that you come onto the board with. At Grand Valley, how we become trustees at Grand Valley is we're appointed by the governor, and we're appointed for a long period of time, for 8 years actually. And so and none of the decisions that we make, we don't have to, be concerned that the party isn't going to endorse us the next time, or we don't have to do, any of those kinds of partisan things. And I was always amazed because there was an individual on the board, most of the time that I was on, his name was Dan Aronoff, and he was a libertarian. And I consider myself to be left of center, progressive. And we clearly were able to reach common ground. I don't think, other than on maybe how much tuition should be increased at one time, that we voted differently on issues. And I found that very, very interesting, that we were able to do that. And of course, we were able to do that because we were, by all of you, all of these layers of brilliant ideas and research and facts and evidence that were brought to us to make the decision. The work was all done by all of you before we even had to get to that point. I just wanted to address a couple of things that come to my attention more recently. Well, one when I was on the board, and because they clearly relate to the perception of politicization. And there's an organization called the American College and Trustees Association. The acronym is ACTA. And an individual named Ann Neal, and I'm not sure if she's head of it continuously or if she's involved in it, she recommended that trustees, and again, this is a trustee organization, there's magazines and reading materials that we get. She recommended that we monitor the classrooms for an even distribution of political views, number one, and number two, that we should publicize those reports. Now again, we have a responsibility, or the board has a responsibility to monitor, a fiduciary responsibility actually, for academic quality. What we do though is oversight. And I can't imagine at Grand Valley that any of those things would have ever come up this close. But I think that's an example of this particular issues, and there are a lot of colleges that are active in this organization. So, the second issue more recently that really concerns me is that, and perhaps you've read about this, but the Michigan Senate, in the budget proposal in April 2014, put in the budget proposal that if any university would teach labor negotiation or labor relations, that they would be fined $500,000. And it was specifically directed toward Michigan State University in response to some labor negotiations. It was dead in the water. It never made it out of the committee, but unfortunately for them, it was widely publicized.
I heard about it in Ohio.
Yeah, okay. And those are the examples that I have of the trustee.
Good. And so those are great examples of actual politicization that are in play at the level of university curriculum and policy, where some outside forces are trying to come in and affect university policy. But Mill has this additional argument here, which I think is insightful. Strange it is that men should admit the validity of the arguments for free discussion, but object to their being pushed to an extreme, not seeing that unless the reasons are good for an extreme case, they are not good for any case. Strange that they should imagine that they are not assuming infallibility when they acknowledge that there should be free discussion on all subjects which can possibly be doubtful, but think that some particular principle or doctrine should be forbidden to be questioned because it is so certain, that is, because they are certain it is certain. To call any proposition certain, while there is anyone who would deny its certainty if permitted, but who is not permitted, is to assume that we ourselves and those who agree with us are the judges of certainty, and judges without hearing the other side. So when we're thinking about actual politicization, we've got a couple of ideas for how to address that. And notice, as I mentioned already, I think some of this can be addressed by presenting the actual clash of positions within the course syllabus. It's kind of hard to be accused of politicizing your teaching if you got everything in there and you're pushing students to truly evaluate them all. Notice this also may require differences in program design. One of the things I've talked with my department about, and we all love the idea, although fitting it into course rotation might be difficult because we already have so many courses we have to cover, would be to have a course specifically on science and religion and the conflict between them in American politics. We're a joint philosophy and religious studies department. I can't think of a better department to bring their expertise to that topic than to offer some course like that to students, to have experts from those two fields weigh in on what the nature of the dispute is, why it exists, how we could address it, and how we could move forward. Notice also one way to try to address this is to have speakers series, and I know that there are many forms of speaker series that we do have, commencement speakers, that kind of thing. But perhaps something kind of like what the Hauenstein Center is doing. I love the proposal someone made about the summit for next year, having business leaders talk about why they lean so far to the right, right? Love it. So notice, you're locked into this now, Gleaves. But what's so nice about that is if we think about that as being somewhat akin to a speaker series, then you're going to have those arguments presented on each side and presented very forcefully on each side. So notice then this is going to require that we absolutely eschew legislative, political, special interest maneuvers, and this requires that we support academic freedom to the utmost. And I think this also requires that we be very even-handed with our colleagues and very critical of ourselves to not levy the charge of politicization lightly. Because notice, if someone is presenting the clash of ideas in an argument or in a course design, they may be presenting the clash of ideas in ways that you don't like, and it wouldn't be how you would teach it. It may even offer a different shade of interpretation for how you would teach it. But to give a charge of politicization for that is, I think, quite unfair. So again, I have no necessary and sufficient set of conditions for what politicization is or how we should identify it in all cases, I think that's a topic for another day. We've made remarkable progress in this summit, but that will require, I think, a lot more sustained philosophic work to address that problem. But at the very least, I think what we can say is we should be cognizant that we've often, I think, on the left and the right, been very quick to charge the other with politicization, and that in and of itself is the problem. So trying to maintain academic freedom at all costs and an adherence to the traditions that we teach and the disciplines that we teach and respect for that. And then again, the concept of civility, near and dear to my heart, try to institute that within the college and the university's mission. So some universities have gone so far as to form an official civility policy. And one of the contributors to our book made an argument that that was a wretched proposal because what it effectively did is allowed a mechanism whereby some groups could be harmed at the expense of others. And really, and his point is good, but his argument boiled down to one simple thing, which is that the policy wasn't being applied consistently. That's not an argument against having a policy. That's an argument against applying it inconsistently. Right? So what we truly need here then, I think, is a deliberate, conscious campus climate on all campuses that promotes civility as being not just a byproduct of liberal education, but one of the essential outcomes of a liberal education. So how do you address this with regard to the perception? Well, notice I think it's important to highlight to the students themselves that you're teaching them skills of thought and addressing that within your own courses, the course design, the university mission. Also to emphasize the importance of free inquiry with the types of speakers that you invite, the types of courses that you suggest to students in advising, the kinds of programs that you develop. But then also to try to push this at the level of university policy to strategic plans, to be thinking about trying to minimize politicization within the academy as part of the strategic plan of the university. And if we think of the tradition that we have in academia as this body of knowledge that we have been entrusted with in the course of our short span of our lives, some of us 60 years, 80 years, Ralph Hauenstein, 102 years, remarkable. But if you think about the short span of history that we each sit within, we've been given this body of knowledge to transmit from generation to generation. And so thinking about how universities do that and adopting a specific strategic plan so that we can ensure that we pass this down through the ages in a fair way is, I think, an important project at the level of university policy. All right, so moving on to the career and demographic proposals. I love this cartoon. We have a fourth brother, admit no evil, but he left the group for a career in politics. All right. So Emil says, he who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. His reasons may be good, and no one may have been able to refute them. But if he is equally unable to refute the reasons on the opposite side, if he does not so much as know what they are, he has no ground for preferring either opinion. The rational position for him would be suspension of judgment, and unless he contents himself with that, simply having to say, I just don't know, right? He is either led by authority or adopts, like the generality of the world, the side to which he feels the most inclination. Nor is it enough that he should hear the arguments of adversaries from his own teachers presented as they state them, and accompanied by what they offer as refutations. That is not the way to do justice to arguments or to bring them into real contact with his own mind. He must be able to hear them from persons who actually believe them, who defend them in earnest, who do their very utmost for them. He must know them in their most plausible and persuasive form. He must feel the whole force of the difficulty, which the true view of the subject has to encounter and dispose of, else he will never really possess himself of that portion of the truth which meets and removes that difficulty. And so for those of you, and I know that some of you probably are because I've had conversations with many of you, feeling a bit of discomfort at the idea that we can't be so comfortable in our teaching of students, that we should shy away from conflict. I think Mill presents the case here very forcefully which is that's the essential component of developing those athletic skills of the mind, where we can critically engage. We must push the students, and we must offer them that opportunity by having others to present this in the strongest possible form. So, how can we address the politicization here? Well, notice forceful argumentation is going to be required to develop the skills, but notice also that devil's advocacy is good, but it's insufficient. To truly have a diverse intellectual populace requires understanding from a spectrum of thinkers. Again, an idea that many of us have talked about over the course of this summit. So how do we address the perception here? Well, I think it's important to take the mission of what we do in the academy, we've got to take it to the streets. In many ways, we've got to take the message of what we do out to the public, out to the students, and out to the parents. And I think we've done a poor job of that in expressing the importance of what we do and not letting our mission and the discussion of what our mission is get hijacked by what I see as political agendas of those outside the academy. So the public square, I think one of the ways that we can really market what we do for liberal education is to co-opt the old-fashioned notion of a public square and redefine it again in terms of the notion of a marketplace of ideas, and really use that concept to try to explain to students, parents, and society the nature of our work, what it is that we do as liberal educators. And part of this, I think, goes beyond just talking about what we do and goes again back to thinking about the nature of the academy itself, thinking about this as a unique institution. And the message, I think, that's helpful to send students, parents, and the broader culture is that there is no other institution in our entire modern American society that offers anything like this at all. It is truly unique. And so the metaphor that might be helpful here is to think of a boxing ring. You can certainly engage in squabbles in dark corners with those with whom you disagree, right? You get bloody noses anywhere. But if you want to engage in an actual competitive match, you've got to be in the ring. And if you're not in the ring, you're just not in the game. Why? Because this is the actual space where that occurs, where the games occur, where the competition actually happens, not you just beating someone up because they insulted your character. Right? That's a different matter. So again, going back to the issue of the broader culture, how can we address that? Love this quote too. I love them. I could read political cartoons all day and do nothing else. So when we're thinking about this, I think there are two arguments that we can make. I'm going to make them both, and I know that this will probably also make some of you uncomfortable. I think we need to make both the pragmatic argument and the ethical argument. And many of you have done a fine job of presenting wonderful ethical arguments on the importance of pursuing truth, the importance of pursuing beauty, the importance of pursuing knowledge, the essential role in developing what it is to have a good life, and those are fine and valuable things. And I think that I'm a philosopher. This is my discipline to pass this down from every generation from the very beginning. No one believes this more fervently than me, but we're preaching to the choir. So the real issue here is how do we convince those who are not convinced, right, of the benefits of these. So I'm going to start with the pragmatic arguments first. All these examples are going to come from philosophy because, again, it's the field with which I can speak most authoritatively. In philosophy, there's been lots of research done to try to recorrect the image that philosophers are the ones always standing in unemployment lines. And despite Brad Burzer's fantastic talk about how the liberal arts are dead, I can't speak for all the liberal arts. Philosophy certainly is not dead. There's some wonderful evidence the past 10 years that there's been a surprising turnaround, and that philosophers in particular, and as you'll see some other students of liberal arts, are very much in demand. They're being hired in a surprising uptake in the business world and other areas outside of the academy. So I'll blow this up for you a little bit so you can see. This is just looking at GRE scores, and to get a conception of the skills that students develop from this discipline. Notice philosophy is off the charts for verbal. We're not so great in the quantitative. That's the math stuff, right? Analytical writing, again, off the charts. But notice we've got English, political science, psychology, economics. All of these are still highly ranked fields. You saw the whole chart. Here's mean LSAT scores by major. I'll blow this up again. Philosophy and theology, second place. Economics is, note, second. We've got history down at 8, foreign languages at 10. It keeps going down the list. But notice that students from the liberal arts are performing well on tests going into fields that we might not expect. Here's another example, GMAT. Again, here's the overall list. Philosophy is at number 4, ranked only behind mathematics, physics, and engineering. When I make the claim that philosophy uniquely teaches some important skills of thought, I'm not blowing smoke. We've got some data here to back this up. I think that this data is there to be found for the other liberal arts too. I don't have it because I haven't invested the time in finding it. It's not my field. But I think it is there to be found, and so I think an important part of addressing the perceived politicization in the academy is to make very clear to the public what it is that we do. We can talk about critical thinking and writing all we like, but for parents and students to realize that these actually transfer into some other sorts of skills and capacities. This one I think is the most interesting. This is median mid-career salary. So econ is at the top, 98,600, computer science, 95. Here's what I think is most interesting. Here's philosophy, 81,200. Notice what's below that is business management. I don't know about Grand Valley, but at Youngstown State, students come in always with the perception that they should go into business and they should go into some form of management because they will make more money. And for many of our students, that's the conception of a good life. That's the conception of a life that's comfortable, that will enable them to have families, that will enable them to pursue the other things of life that they also think are important. Well, this is fascinating. Why do we see this? Well, the individuals who made this argument made a proposal. They said they thought that perhaps what's going on here is that when it comes to philosophy, it teaches those skills of the mind which truly enable one to be a leader. And so management courses themselves don't teach those mental skills. They teach you practical skills, theoretical skills of how to address labor. But these kinds of skills that we teach in the liberal arts really offer you an opportunity to truly become a leader. And those transfer into money. So I don't want to be too pedestrian about this, but to make the case for those who are already not persuaded, these numbers are important. So I think it's important to market the marketplace. Market what we do. We're already doing it. Just take the message to the streets. So we sell, we provide, we offer, we train, we develop, we are skills of thought, reasoning, argumentation. And they have not just good in themselves, they have many values. They have personal value, they have social value, and they have economic value. And they're not exclusive. And so it's in this context I think we can go back to the ethical argument, which is what's underlying all of this. We have a conception of the good life. We have a conception of the role and the importance of the liberal arts and the humanities. And I think that it's right. Why are they important? Because notice what they provide is the common ground. And we all have realized that. We've described it in different ways, I think with different words. We've captured it by picking out different properties and features of the phenomena, but that is the essence behind what all of us have been arguing. And so thinking of Milligan here as the ethical argument, why does this matter? What is the goal? What is the big picture of the puzzle that we're putting together piece by piece? Again, I think it's important to keep this in mind. The goal here, the ethical argument and what's behind it here, is the development of the citizenry itself. And not for a single individual, not for a single student, not just for your son or daughter, but for all of us in this populace. This is our collective citizenry. So I'm going to turn it back to Noreen at this point.
At this time, I'm going to address, this is my slide, the beauty of doubt, the necessity of respect, and the shame of derision, and what it is that I think that we can do about it. Okay. And as others in this conference have mentioned, not only mentioned, but developed highly, we have a profoundly serious national problem consisting of hyper-partisanship, fueled by an ideological press and a ubiquitous internet. Juvenile rhetoric, derision without shame, and misinformation have created a situation where the beauty of doubt and the value of respect have been diminished significantly. Contrary to Voltaire's quote, that doubt may be an uncomfortable condition, but certainty is an absurd one, the notion of certainty has been elevated to rock star status. As the brainchild of Gleaves Whitney, and with the generous support of Annette Kirk and Ralph Hauenstein and others, Grand Valley and the Hauenstein Center has an institutionalized response to this problem of incivility by the creation of the Common Ground Initiative. And the purpose of the Common Ground Initiative is to provide a neutral environment for rigorous intellectual inquiry in an attempt to find common ground. We're unique in higher education, and in addition to the Common Ground Initiative within the Hauenstein Center, Grand Valley also has an academic program. We have an endowed chair, the Padnos Sarosic chair for the chair for civil discourse. That's within our university. So Grand Valley's on the cutting edge of this issue of civility in politics. The question of common ground itself is a critical one because we need it to move the country forward and because we're in this democratic enterprise together. In Gleaves' writings about the initiative, he cites many historical examples where efforts to find common ground across differing opinions and ethics that when they have moved this country to a better place. For example, he uses, among other examples, he uses the example of the civil rights movement, where the issue or the notion of the separation of church and state was not emphasized in light of the evangelicalism of the movement's leaders. Thus far at Common Ground Initiative, there have been provided forums on first principles. And surveys have shown that people may think that they know, that they can explain why they believe what they do, and in reality, when they might have a particular policy position, but they really can't justify it, not just by facts, but they can't identify what's the purpose of government and these different things. And so one of the things that we have done thus far, again at Common Ground Initiative, is we had a forum called What is Progressive and What is Conservative. And the Elliots participated in that, I participated in that, and it's absolutely critical. For as Kierkegaard said, there's no such thing as presuppositionless thought. It's absolutely critical in order to have a civil conversation that we understand what others think, but we also really need to be able to articulate and identify our own assumptions. We've also had coffee shop debates. Specifically, there was a rigorous, spirited examination of the issue of minimum wage. And we brought in highly respected speakers, among others, Jonathan Haidt, who you probably have read his writings, but I think he's particularly relevant to the whole idea of common ground because he believes that there will be less derision and less demonization if we understand that there are unconscious processes and psychological motivations. And in other words, if we understand these, really understand where people are coming from, that can lead to respect and it can lead to understanding and undermine the validity of people saying, oh, they're just ignorant or starting Facebook pages that are called Too Informed to Vote Republican. Things like that drive me crazy. We also had Senator Olympia Snowe, who, of course, warned against scorched earth politics, and she left the Senate. She said she left the Senate because the voting had become the first thing that when they voted, they emphasized, or they voted based on party, and she believes that you should vote based on the nation first, the state second, and then party. And she's taking her case on the road, and it was quite a fascinating speaker. So I believe strongly that a public university has a responsibility to further civic engagement, and CGI fulfills that responsibility quite admirably by opening up all of the things we do to the community, to everybody in the community. In the book Closed Minds, Politics and Ideology in the University, Bruce Smith and others concluded that the concern about politicization of the liberal arts has led to too little genuine discussion. Whatever the answer, at CGI, we embrace the complexity of the issue, and we'll continue to subject it, as we have here, to rigorous debate, using facts and evidence, and relying upon the willingness of our participants to become constructively engaged.
And so we really just want to, I'm going to go back very quickly. Oops, I skipped it. There was one more image that sort of captured nicely. All right, I'm just going to go to the image. There was one more image that captured really nicely. We found this and thought it really encapsulated many of the concepts that were going on in the summit this whole past few days. We might think about what we're doing in the academy and in the culture itself as a tug of war, but a tug of war that's frozen in bronze, that never ends, and the common ground might be the rope between us. And so we've all got a grasp on it, right? We're all struggling, not vainly, I hope, with all of our might, but it's exactly that kind of competitive engagement which is the enterprise. And so to see what we're doing as trying to shy away from the actual competitive engagement might be to do a disservice to the very nature of the marketplace of ideas. So to truly expand the marketplace of ideas, what we do at the university is to take that message to the public and express to them the importance of this institution and why we're part of this long tradition that stretches all the way back to antiquity. So, thank you.
Questions?
So I know we're short on time, but...
After a plug like that, I'm not going to cut you off. I think we only have time for one or two questions. Well, don't be too shy.
Please, could you speak to the intellectual leadership of Noreen Myers in the CGI? How has she been central?
Did you address that to me?
Yes.
Absolutely. Thanks. When we started talking about the Common Ground Initiative, Don Lubbers, Annette Kirk, Provost Davis, university leadership, very, very receptive. Fred, you and I, and Noreen had a lunch at Charlie's Crab that was fundamentally important. And out of that, I think there started to emerge a consensus about how valuable and important this initiative would be. And Noreen is somebody who, by her example, I think embodies so much of what we're trying to achieve here. I'm really proud to have her as a colleague here. We're really fortunate at Grand Valley. I still call her our trustee because she's a trustee of an idea. She's a trustee of an idea that I think is really central to a liberal education, and she totally gets it. Now, we don't always see eye to eye on the politics, but boy, we have so much of common ground between us and our respect for each other, the ideas and our aspirations, and I just have the most enormous respect for what Noreen has done in her career and what she's doing here at Grand Valley as a trustee, more than just in a political sense, but of a guardian of a tradition. One little funny story. At one point, I thought it was important to get people together to understand where they were coming from. And so we had Provost Davis, Noreen Myers, go up to Mecosta, Michigan, up to the Russell Kirk Center to be hosted by Annette Kirk. And so there they are sitting around the table talking about their backgrounds. And a very, very nice conversation. But it really broke wide open. And it was humorous when Noreen started saying, yeah, I have some relatives who were in Plymouth, Michigan, which is where Russell Kirk was born. And what was the year? Okay, right around the end of World War I. And so, lo and behold, out of that luncheon, we learned that Noreen's Uncle Luther actually delivered Russell Kirk. Now, that is so serendipitous. It's just one of those wonderful instances where a happy accident brings people closer together. And that's what I like to think that we're doing at the Common Ground Institute. May I just go ahead and take this opportunity to close? First of all, let me just say thank you to both of you. I couldn't have imagined a better way to conclude this summit. I didn't know what it would turn out like. My staff know I've been very nervous through the 3 days because you just never know when and they've worked so hard. But I've got to tell you, I couldn't be prouder of what we've been able to accomplish the last 3 days. Hey, I hope we're applauding for everybody who participated, and what a great way to end. You know, we saw this presentation in a little bit different form this winter, and I got to tell you, Deborah, this is a great rerun. This is a better rerun than the original, and I think Noreen really adds a nice touch to it also. Noreen, if ever you need a job as marketing, we've got a place for you right here at the Hauenstein Center. Now, I want to just thank a few other people. First of all, I want to thank my staff. Tori, stand up. Tori is such a credit to the Hauenstein Center, to Grand Valley, and to West Michigan. She works really hard. She is the one who made so many of these details come together, and I couldn't praise you more highly to say thank you so much for all your hard work and making this possible, because you're doing all the nuts and bolts of it. A lot of us can talk about the ideas, but if we don't have you actually staying on track for everything that was going on, nothing happens. So I want to thank all of the staff. Kathy did so much, Morgan did so much, Chad, I'm looking at Delane, Joe Hogan. Joe, this was a baptism by fire. I've just got to tell you. This is Joe's first week of work with us. And I told him, I'm going to throw you in the deep end of the pool. I want you to learn to become comfortable as a rhetor. And he just conducted himself so admirably in all the introductions. Joe, thank you so much. To our partner, Annette Kirk, thank you for continuing to be so supportive of this effort. We love you and appreciate everything that you bring to us, the civility, the depth of discourse, and such a keen intelligence that you possess. And what is often overlooked about your career, Annette, is all of the ways that you have mentored so many people. You don't just talk about this. It's not just in books. You live it. You and Russell always lived it and got it. And I just think you're such a gift to us. And then our partners, yes, let's applaud. Thanks, Fred. Absolutely. And then we've had some wonderfully generous donors as well. Ralph Hauenstein, it goes without saying, at 102 years old, he continues to have the civic engagement that you're talking about that's truly remarkable. He's an inspiration for us for life, a long life, well lived, that always includes that civic engagement. I would like to hasten to include the Dyer Ives Foundation and the Earhart Foundation. One of those foundations is pretty far left. The other foundation is pretty far right. We're proud to have received money from both foundations in recognition for what we're doing. This follows an NEH grant, which sort of right down tries to look right down the middle of this. So I think we kind of got the good housekeeping seal of approval when you look at the range of funding that came in to support the Common Ground Initiative and the summit that we just held like this. there's so many other people to thank, the university leadership. Dean Ansack, you've just been fantastic through this. If Gail Davis were here, I see Judy Whip. There's so many people who've done so much to be supportive and helpful. Thank you all. This concludes an outstanding summit, and you ain't seen nothing yet. Take care.
I just so appreciate you. That was so beautiful what you said about us.